Hello and welcome to the fourth episode of the Guildwood Review. My name is Rashed Chaudhary. I'm a historian and an independent scholar, and I'm coming to you today from Guildwood, which is in Scarborough, which is in Toronto, which is in Ontario, which is in Canada. This is a podcast of ideas, a podcast where I interview experts in various fields about the work that they are passionate about. And the goal is to help you understand your world, to help all of us understand the world that we live in and share. Today, my guest is Keith Neuman, who is originally from the United States, but is based in Ottawa, in Ontario, here in Canada, where he is a senior associate at the Environics Institute for Survey Research. And Keith and I are going to be talking about the wave of Syrian refugees who came to this country a decade ago and how they have adjusted to life here since. Welcome to this episode of the Guildwood Review. Thank you so much for joining us here. And as it happens, it's Bengali New Year today and yesterday, depending on which part of historic Bengal you're in or related to. So Happy New Year.
And Thank you. Thank you for having me on your show. I look forward to discussing things with you.
That's wonderful. Now, to begin, where in Ontario are you right now?
I'm in Ottawa, which is the nation's capital in Canada. Right. And I live in the West End neighborhood that's typically called Bayshore because there's a big shopping center nearby. So I'm in the Bayshore community in the west side of Ottawa. I think it's because we're actually by the Ottawa River, right, and there's a bit of a bay here on the river. So it actually relates to the Ottawa River.
Great. Okay, so what I wanted to discuss with you is the report that was issued by the Environics Institute relatively recently about the life that Syrian refugees who came to Canada in 2015 have made for themselves here in Canada, and what their impressions of Canada are and how they've adapted to life here, etc. Now, just to give, of course, I imagine that a large proportion of our viewers will be quite familiar with the context that actually brought the refugees from Syria who arrived here in 2015, the context that brought them here in the first place. But just for those who aren't, I'll try to summarize things in approximately three sentences, and then we can proceed to my questions. So first of all, in 2011, as part of the Arab Spring and the reaction of some of the existing Arab regimes to the Arab Spring, a civil war broke out in Syria. That prompted a large-scale exodus of refugees from Syria. Of course, there were internally displaced persons who moved around the country, but also millions of refugees left the country. They initially largely went to neighboring countries such as Turkey and Lebanon and Jordan, and so on. But then a few years down the line, some of them started attempting to look for perhaps greener pastures or places where they could put down permanent roots, because I am, apart from Canada, the context that I'm most familiar with is that of Turkey, since I've lived there as well. And I know that there, the Syrian refugees that are located in Turkey are called persons under international protection. And it's understood by all parties or implicit that this status is meant to be temporary. Now, of course, many of those refugees, are, in fact, the vast majority, are still in Turkey. And now they have lived there long enough to actually qualify for citizenship. And so several hundred thousand, as I understand it, out of the 3.5 million who came to Turkey have already applied for and obtained Turkish citizenship, but that wasn't the initial idea. So in 2015, it wasn't obvious that this would happen. And so a lot of Syrian refugees started looking for places where they could settle down permanently because it looked like the Syrian civil war was not about to wind down. And then we had the 2015 election campaign here in Canada, where one of the planks of the platform of the Liberal Party was that several tens of thousands of Syrian refugees would be brought brought here and allowed to settle in Canada as a humanitarian gesture. And since the Liberals under Justin Trudeau did win the election, this is indeed what ended up happening. And so this is where I would like you to take up the narrative with me. So my first question is, how many Syrian refugees actually did end up coming that year and subsequently to Canada?
Yes, well, thank you for the summation. I think the only thing I would add to your overview is that many of the displaced Syrians in places like Turkey were actually in refugee camps, which was hardly some place that anyone would want to end up permanently.
That
So
is very true. Yeah.
many of them were in limbo, and it was desperation as much as aspiration to find somewhere else to go and some other place to take them. And
If I
other
may just add
countries.
regarding Turkey, because I'm not sure regarding the context in Jordan and in Lebanon. I don't possess much information about that. But when it comes to Turkey, yes, indeed. Initially, they were in refugee camps. And for example, their children were going to schools that were sort of hastily, actually like physically constructed, like within those refugee camps. But over time, though, when it became obvious to the Turkish authorities that this situation was becoming a quasi-permanent one, the Syrian refugees were largely released into society, moved to different parts of the country. Their children were integrated into the regular educational system and so on. But again, we're talking about 2015 when what you're mentioning was exactly the case. Yes.
Right. It was 2015 was only 4 years into the Civil War. Yes. So again, the Canadian government did decide, they made a commitment, I think, before they were elected and once they were in, to bring a significant number of Syrian refugees from this humanitarian crisis to Canada in an unprecedented way. And so from fall of 2015 to the end of 2016, they actually brought about 40,000 Syrians as refugees into the country, which was a massive number but by Canadian standards. And then over the subsequent year or so, I think another 10 to 12,000 came afterwards. So something over 50,000 were resettled in Canada over within a 2-year period. And this may pale in comparison to refugees being resettled in countries like Germany, for instance. But for Canada, it was a massive surge of refugees. The only previous surge in Canadian history was in the end of the 70s with the people from Vietnam and Southeastern Asia being accepted in fairly short order in that time. And that was really the first. And then since then, we have seen a large number of people from Ukraine, but leaving under somewhat similar circumstances. And I think those two populations are very different and so aren't quite the same thing. So I think just to finish off, the government made an unprecedented commitment to bring a large number, and the government mobilized its resources and bureaucracy. Civic society mobilized. The settlement sector organizations across the country that do a lot of the lion's share of the work of resettlement all stepped up. And in that period of time, the country as a whole really kind of mobilized around this, including private citizens who were given the opportunity to be private sponsors. And so it was a very unusual initiative and experience that was not only meaningful for the refugees who found safe harbor and a welcoming country for the most part, but was actually meaningful for many Canadians already here who had stepped up or took the opportunity to be sponsors or supporting in one way or another. And many Canadians across the country, either with friends or with religious communities or other organizations, actually stepped up to help refugees get resettled. So this was a pretty significant event in sort of recent Canadian history, certainly in immigration history. It happened with relatively little controversy or sort of pushback or political opportunistic types of activity. And so in that sense, I think was amazingly successful and smooth as something that was launched and achieved with the involvement of many people in many sectors across the country. And it really was across the whole country. It wasn't just the big cities. And it wasn't just in the places where we might expect most refugees to go, or where we would imagine Canadians would be most welcoming.
Right. And you raised several issues that I was going to touch on in a moment. So let's begin with one in particular. And that is, you mentioned that individual Canadians got the opportunity to sponsor refugees. And this would be those refugees who were in the privately sponsored refugee category, right? And then, according to the Environics report that I referred to, there were two other categories of Syrian refugees. So government-assisted refugees, and then another one. So what were the differences between these three categories of refugees, and how did a person end up being placed in one category and not the other?
Well, I won't get into too many details for this interview, but there were three categories that the government had set up, three streams. So government assisted refugees, GARs, was close to 50% of the total. And those are refugees that are sort of selected, identified by the government, and they are brought over and they receive, I guess, government benefits and supports through programs that either the governments provide or settlement agencies provide. So that's typically probably the single largest category. But there's also a very large category of what are called privately sponsored refugees, PSRs. And this is a program that has been unique to Canada. Until recently, Canada is the only country in the world that has enabled or supported citizens to directly sponsor and support refugees coming to Canada. This started with the Vietnamese refugees. And so these are people who, it's important to point out that most of the refugees who come in through this stream are people that the sponsors already know as family members or friends, or there's some connection, some personal connection or family connection, or it might be through a church or something like that. And this is a situation where the person's identified, and after they go through all the screening and the checks, they come to Canada, and then the private sponsors, who may be affiliated with a church or synagogue or mosque or temple or a group of friends, they have to raise money to support the refugee or refugee family for the first year. So there's a hands-on connection, and there's a lot of the volunteer work and supports that the private sponsors provide. The third category is called the Blended Visa Office Referral Program. This is the smallest category, I think about 10%. And this is a program which the government has set up that's a combination of government and private support. And the difference here is that there are private citizens or organizations that stepped up to be sponsors, but they don't have a previous connection with the refugee. Right. These are refugees referred through UNHCR, and they put, in essence, a book together of people who they determine are eligible for this. And then the private sponsors in Canada look at the list and they identify somebody who they would like to sponsor, which is an individual or a family. And it's what's different is there's no prior connection or knowledge or personal relationship with the refugee. So sometimes it goes under the banner of welcoming the stranger. Mm-hmm. So this is somebody who is just somebody coming from a country, and the program does not just apply to Syrians, people from other countries as well. They arrive, and there are both government supports, but there's also the citizen support, and they have to raise money, and they provide the hands-on support. And part of what they do is help orient them to Canada and Canadian life. They help them connect with a dentist and a doctor, and they teach people about the transit system where they live, and just help them get familiar with what it's like to be in a new country and a new culture. The third category, the BVOR category, is actually the one that had the highest public profile in the Canadian media, and the one that people would hear about, because that's the one that sort of stood out.
Right. Now, you say that until recently, Canada was the only country that had these kinds of programs where individuals or groups could sponsor refugees and bring them to Canada. What other countries have perhaps copied the Canadian example and are implementing it now? Do you happen to know?
It's hard to keep up with what's happening. Sure. But a couple of years ago, I believe Ireland, other countries were paying attention to what was happening in Canada.
Right.
And I think over time, some of them started to, I think, maybe experiment a bit. I think they had pilot programs. So I believe Ireland set up a program. The UK may, Britain may have, England may have tried something. The United States actually set something up, but it really isn't quite the same program, but it's sort of modeled on it. And I think that, Canada really set the model for other countries to kind of do the same thing. But it's interesting, no other country has really embraced it in the same way. And I think for various reasons, but not all, Canada does stand out as being a very multicultural country and a country that is historically and culturally very welcoming to newcomers from different places for all kinds of reasons. We do other research on this, and we know that Canadians, comparatively speaking, are much more open to immigration than most other parts of the world. It's changing somewhat, but it's not changing as much as I think some people might imagine. And culturally, I think Canada is well placed to do this kind of program. And there's evidence that a lot of people that are private sponsors, they get as much out of it as the refugees do. They feel energized and they feel they're doing something good, and they relish or appreciate the contact with the refugee families. So it is something that is still pretty unique to Canada. What is interesting, however, is that the Canadian program has some challenges. I think sometimes in recent years, there have been more citizens wanting to sponsor than there are refugees available to sponsor. And there's been a lot of frustration, both with the opportunity to do this and with the bureaucracy around it. But in previous years, before 2015, it was difficult to find enough private sponsors. So it goes back and forth. And I think the only other thing worth mentioning, which isn't really, I think, well understood, is, this is a federal government program, but the federal government has never, ever promoted it.
Right.
Or done anything to make people aware of it.
So the uptake
or
has
market
just been
it.
fully organic, I suppose.
People hear about it and, their networks and their organizations and so forth, but the government has never gotten around to actively promoting it as a program that's either good for the country or good for the refugees or good for the citizens. So I think in a way it makes it even more impressive how this has been a grassroots kind of initiative. A couple of years ago, we were working with a settlement organization to do a survey of Canadians to measure the level of interest in being a private sponsor. And we estimated that there was probably, well over 1 million Canadians that were really keen to do this.
That's
if
quite
given the
mind-blowing,
opportunity.
Actually.
Yeah. But this kind of program has practical limits and budgetary limits. And there's a real backlog in terms of how the system can process refugees.
And I suppose there's a government cap on the numbers that are admissible into Canada, right? Because otherwise, if you were to ask the 3.5 million, approximately 3.5 million Syrian refugees in Turkey, whether they would be up for moving to Canada, I imagine a significant proportion would say yes. And so what prevents this million Canadians from sponsoring hundreds of thousands of Syrians is probably government limits placed in Canada, right?
Well, yeah, and there are limits. And the government has always had caps or quotas on the number of immigrants in any given stream, whether economic migrants or family reunification. So the number of refugees has always been in the tens of thousands at most across all categories in all countries. And so this initiative with Syrian refugees was very unprecedented. And it had to do with the humanitarian crisis happening in Syria and the profile that had around the world and in Canada. And I think the moment in Canada where the government was changing, and I think that people were looking for ways to do something. Canadians are by large very outward focusing in terms of being aware of what's happening in the world. We've done research on this too. And, by and large, Canadians are paying attention to what's happening elsewhere. And they have a sense of Canada having a role in the world and, being a place where we can make a positive contribution. And, decades ago, when we would ask Canadians, what can Canada do to contribute to the world? The most obvious response was peacekeeping.
Right. And that's the
which
legacy
used
of
to
Lester
be
Pearson, right?
Yes, that legacy lasted in the public mind much longer than the reality of it.
Yeah. 'Cause now
But in
essentially
the
that role
last
has been
number of
taken on by countries like Bangladesh and Pakistan and so on.
Yeah, but over the last number of years, when we ask Canadians that kind of question, increasingly they say our role in the world is to be a welcoming multicultural country, to celebrate diversity. And of course, not all Canadians agree on that. Not all Canadians agree on anything. But I think that that has increasingly become the sort of sense of identity that many Canadians have about what Canada is, what should it aspire to be, and thinking of it in a global context. What contribution can we make to the world, making the world a better place? And this identity, I think, had evolved to the point by 2015 that the country was open to this. And there was very little backlash. There was very little skepticism or sort of problems, really, or polarization around this. So that in itself is quite amazing. And, that was a moment. And I think a lot of people felt very good about it. We, on one of our surveys around 2017 or so, we asked a random sample of Canadians if they had been involved in refugee sponsorship, either directly or indirectly. And something like 9% of the population said yes.
Right.
So
Massive.
that's not very accurate.
Well,
That
perhaps they made sort of even small sort of financial contributions to groups that were sponsoring refugees and that sort of thing, I imagine.
well, that's some of it, but I think the other thing is that a lot of people sort of wanted to be part of it,
Right.
and
They
so
were
they sort of.
psychologically involved more than physically involved.
So sometimes people answer questions in an aspirational way, and
Right.
I think what it told us was this was seen as a really positive thing, and people wanted to be associated with a positive thing. So that's really, I think, what that told us. So anyway, so this was the initiative. Governments and the organizations mobilized. There are hundreds of settlement organizations in communities across the country that have been operating for years to do various forms of support for all kinds of immigrants. And so they had a role. So they came in a very quick period of time, and they arrived and they're here. And so just to give you some background on the report that you mentioned, so our institute is a nonprofit, public interest social research institute. We're very small. We focus on Canada, and we have done other projects looking at specific communities in Canada that may be marginalized or not well understood. And in this case, we felt that it might be valuable to do a study of Syrian refugees who had arrived in Canada several years before to understand their experience several years after they arrived. And we did this research because no one else had done this kind of research. There was a number of other small studies that were done right after refugees arrived, sort of initial experience, and that was all very useful. And we wanted to find out what was happening 5 years later. So that was really what we set out to do. And, and we took a couple of years to do the research, and then we published it and have posted it's all public. And then the year afterwards, we spent a year doing outreach across the country to
Which is how I
engage
got
with
to know
different
about
organizations to speak about it.
Right.
So that the research would be shared, and shared not just with people in government, but people in settlement agencies, with the Syrian community. We had several sessions with the Syrian community. We also produced a video, a 20-minute video
I will
about
link to
the
that.
study and the experience, which is in both English and Arabic. So I think our goal was not only to do this research, but to really put it in the hands of the people in Canada and maybe other countries that might learn from it.
Right. Yeah. And I would say, I mean, it is a very effective piece of research because it goes into a lot of depth. I mean, I've read the report cover to cover, and it provides a tremendous volume of insights into the experience of the Syrian refugees in Canada as seen by themselves. And I will post a link to the PDF version of the report as well underneath the video. Now, getting into some of the details within the report, what kind of demographic profile emerges from the surveys that were conducted? In other words, when we look at the Syrian refugee community in Canada, what would be their sort of age and gender distribution, as well as the proportions of different ethnicities that are found in Syria that are covered within the group that's in Canada, and also religions?
Well, that's a lot of questions.
Sure,
I don't think I can do
forward.
justice to all the details, but
Right.
I'll just cover a few points. First, our objective was to do research with a representative sample of that group of 40,000 who came in that time period. And obviously, that group of refugees is not representative of all Syrians, of course,
Sure.
or even all Syrian refugees. And we worked with the federal government, and because they have good records on all the refugees, we were able to draw sort of a representative sample of refugees. We ended up interviewing about 300 refugees. And so our sample is broadly representative of that population. So, I'm not going to try and give you numbers. It's men and women. It's a fairly young population, some underage, but families with a lot of young children. The co founder of our institute, he and his partner, who was a Vietnamese refugee, privately sponsored a family with 7 children. So that's a large family.
Yeah.
So, how to characterize it. So I think people tended to be settled more in cities, large cities, but a lot of them were settled in small towns and small areas of the country. There was an intention to distribute them across the country for various reasons, including not putting too much pressure in any one place for support. So, it's a range in terms of age and gender, education, and all other kinds of characteristics. In terms of religion, I think mostly Muslim, but some Christian. So all those details are in the report, but it is, it's diverse in that sense.
Yeah.
And I think, just to make the point, the reason why we did a survey of 300 rather than doing interviews with a smaller number, which is a more common research technique, was to be able to cover the population and to be able to look at some of the differences by age and gender and education level and background and religion. So we could see whether there were differences and similarities, as well as across the different 3 admission streams and understand how they worked out. So we really wanted to talk to as many people as we could. At the same time, we didn't want to do a standard poll or survey as is typically done, because those questions tend to be pretty cut and dried, and structured. And it's not always possible to really appreciate the lived experience by simply asking, rate this and rate that, and is it yes or no? So we had a long interview protocol, but we had between 30 and 40 open-ended questions where we gave refugees the opportunity to tell their story and to expand upon their experience and talk about things in a way that you would not get on a standard survey. So it's kind of a mix of quantitative and qualitative. We've used this approach with other populations, including urban indigenous people and people in the Black community, and it provides a balance between representing the population and getting some sense of what their lives are really like.
Right. No, it's a very interesting approach for sure. And you mentioned that one of the reasons why you wanted a fairly large group of participants is so that you could look at the subcategories within the larger body of respondents and sort of analyze the differences. So given that one of the criteria by which people were categorized was ethnicity and another was religion, among others, then I was wondering if you found any significant differences in the experiences of Muslim versus Christian Syrians, and in terms of ethnicity, sort of Arab versus Armenian versus Kurdish Syrians.
Yeah, I actually don't have too much to say about that. But first, the distribution of those categories, because the population was not balanced in some of those dimensions,
right.
we didn't have enough people in each of those categories to be able to make good comparisons. You know what I mean?
Right. That makes sense.
So issues like age and gender and admission stream and some other categories.
There you had statistically significant results, right? I imagine.
We had enough data to make valid comparisons. But the extent to which we were able to look at things like, so ethnicity, really, we didn't have enough of distribution.
Right.
We asked about it. We recorded that in our survey.
Yeah, because
but we really couldn't do an analysis by it.
Okay, that makes sense.
On religion, we could do a bit, but those categories did not really show any meaningful differences on most of our questions.
That in itself,
it was not a particular. It really wasn't sort of a major factor, if you will,
right,
in terms of experience or outcomes. And so it did not figure very prominently in our results, in our conclusions. So there wasn't much we could say. I guess what I will say to people listening is that there are a lot of details in the report. And in addition to the report on our website, we've also published what we call data tables. And for somebody that's looking for something very specific, in the data tables, we have pages for every question in the survey and with results broken down by many, many groups,
Mm.
including religion, where if somebody is looking for a particular finding or a particular detail, there's a good chance it will be in those tables.
Right. Then they can
So there is
do their own
information, but
analysis.
I think that really is up to people who are looking for something very specific.
Sure.
But we do make that available.
Oh, that's great. Now, moving on to the next section of the report, it talks about how much or how little the refugees knew about Canada before arriving here, and then what sorts of things surprised them that they hadn't previously known about. So, could you tell us a bit about those kinds of things?
Sure. Yeah. And certainly at that time period, when the government was starting to bring refugees over, there wasn't really much in the way of infrastructure or resources that the government had in place to give orientation to refugees before they came. That changed in subsequent years. Several years later, the government actually put in place an online portal with a lot of good information. And so I think that changed. But I
Mm-hmm.
think what we learned from the survey is that most of the refugees didn't have much of an orientation or much knowledge about Canada before they arrived.
Right.
The exception was those who were privately sponsored that had family or friends in Canada
Mm-hmm.
had the benefit of those friends and family, giving them some information in advance and helping
That
them
makes
get
sense.
prepared.
Mm-hmm.
So they were actually much better equipped. But most of them didn't know that much. And so, they might have done some internet searching, who knows, but it wasn't people didn't really have a really good idea of what to expect.
Mm.
Many of them arrived in winter. The first wave
Yeah, I
arrived in
remember.
winter 2015, 2016. And, their sponsors might have been at the airport with winter coats. But so certainly climate was one of the things that people maybe imagined it would be colder, but still a surprise.
Yeah.
So I
How
think
cold it actually
people
was.
it was just someplace new and unfamiliar. And most people coming as refugees didn't have any experience with Western cities or
Mm.
whatever. So certainly climate, language, most of the refugees had little or no English or French.
Right.
Not surprising. Um, and I think just some culture shock and being, if they were in a big city or different environment and just a whole different place and just a whole other way of being. So I think it's hard for us in Canada to appreciate what that culture shock is like because most of us have never done anything like that before.
Right.
Um, so I think that was a bit of a challenge. And those refugees that were privately sponsored were able to acclimate quicker because they had a more personal hands-on treatment. Some of these private sponsors, there might have been, 20 or 25 people who signed up to help with a group. And so some of these refugees were almost sometimes inundated, people wanting to help. What can we do for you? And certainly there were some cases of some refugees who felt that the private sponsors were overdoing it
Mm-hmm.
and maybe doing more than was needed or more than they were asked to, or maybe they felt, kind of overwhelmed. But clearly there was a process of getting used to being in Canada. And I think certainly the biggest, earliest barrier was language, because obviously one needs to have some comprehension of English or French. Even if you've got Arab speaking sponsors, you're still living in a Canadian community. So,
Yep.
language, first and foremost, was a particular challenge. Children were less likely to have any language than older. They're adults, but it was actually children that learned the
That makes
quickest,
sense.
which is typically
Mm.
what happens. And what was interesting was we asked refugees to evaluate their English or French when they arrived, and then 5 years later,
Right.
both in reading, comprehension, speaking, and so forth. And so the English or French fluency when they arrived was very limited for most, but almost everybody had made huge strides
Right.
5 years later.
Mm-hmm.
So this was a process. Obviously, the government provided some language training. There were other ways to learn language. Children learned in school, but language was a very significant barrier. People struggled with climate. People struggled with culture shock. I think some people it was not different, but a lot of people just didn't feel comfortable. It was just not the way they are used to doing
It's just
things.
a very different society, I suppose, right?
Yeah, a different society.
You mentioned that for a lot of us, if we come to Canada, it's not, as big a difference, as big a culture shock as it would be for someone moving from a society as different from Canadian society as Syria is. And of course, for a lot of people here as well, they haven't. A lot of Canadians, obviously, the vast majority haven't moved from anywhere to Canada. About
Yeah.
4/5 haven't. The other fifth have, but often it's from at least somewhat similar societies. But I think if it is from a very different society, and I'm thinking of, for example, myself moving from Kuwait to the US in
Yes.
1999, the reason why that didn't feel particularly disconcerting is because in Kuwait, you largely grow up in a very Americanized media environment. You're,
Yep.
you're watching American TV shows. Well, you're also watching British and other English-speaking TV shows, a bit of French TV as well. And so, yes, maybe you don't see rural Iowa and the details of life there while living in Kuwait, but at least you're more or less familiar with the culture. As you mentioned, if most of the Syrians who came to Canada didn't speak English or French prior to coming here, then they wouldn't have been in that same media world before their move. So it makes sense that the distinction would be more jarring to
Yeah.
them when they're.
Well, and let me just add two more points to that.
Yes,
First, many of the refugees came from rural backgrounds.
Right.
Some urban, but many rural.
That's very interesting.
So, coming from rural Syria
Mhm.
and ending up in downtown Toronto
Yeah.
or Montreal.
That would be strange indeed.
And then the other dimension, this which I think is easy to maybe forget about, is that they were coming as displaced refugees.
Of course. Yeah, they'd been
They
through
were
trauma
not
and
coming
pain.
as economic migrants
Sure.
looking for new career opportunities
Yeah.
or as young people going to study or being reunited with family, because they want to be with family. Many of them had very, very difficult times being displaced and being
Of
in
course.
refugee camps. And so what they had to bring with them and the experiences they brought with them included a lot of trauma. And that's, that's a harder thing to measure and appreciate. But quite clearly, that is something that adds a whole level of challenge to everything else they have to deal with in terms of difference.
Absolutely.
Now, in our research, we weren't really in a position to really talk to them very much about trauma for a number of
Is it
reasons.
because you felt they'd be reticent to answer and
Well-
participate in the survey?
Well, partly, I think when you do research, social research,
Mhm.
when you want to explore trauma, you have to take a very specialized approach.
Right, because you have to get the
Um,
ethics right. You don't want to end up hurting them more.
And it's not just ethics, but it's how you approach it and the circumstances of the interview, and you really have to approach it in a different way.
Mm.
And that was really beyond the scope
Sure.
of what we could do.
Yeah.
We did ask people about their mental health and stress in their lives, so we were able to touch on it in an indirect way. But I think it's very important to keep in mind what's going on for people coming under these circumstances. And it'd be very different. Some people may have been very fortunate, had little trauma, and other people may have had a lot.
So
And
I wonder then who was in a position to help them with that. I mean, you mentioned, for example, sponsors, of course, like the sponsoring individuals and organizations, and in particular, of course, for those people who had relatives here already, them, stepping forward at once with information and
Yep.
with winter clothes and so on. So that's a way to deal with, like, the question of how to open a bank account and how to find the nearest
the
metro
practical
station.
parts.
And yeah, exactly, those kinds of things. But when it comes to dealing with deep-seated sort of accumulated psychological problems, was there anybody, for example, the provincial healthcare systems or anybody else who actually kind of took ownership of that issue and tried to help them systematically, or were they kind of left kind of free-floating in that regard?
Well, that's a really good question. That wasn't something that we could really get at very well with our
Sure.
research, but I think probably it was a combination of things. I mean, they had official access to the healthcare system.
Right.
And from what we understood, they probably got better access to the healthcare system than other immigrant groups.
Mhm.
I think they were probably given some privileged or expedited access as refugees,
Makes
which
sense.
caused some maybe resentment in other groups. But I suspect that a lot of it came from other Syrians in their community,
Right.
refugees or not, or other parts of the Arab community, particularly in cities where there were communities and there were ways to connect with others
Right.
who would know the language and the culture. And so I expect that that was probably really important. I think settlement agencies that are operating on the ground understand these issues with other kinds of refugees and immigrants. So probably had some supports and resources that they could bring in. And the private sponsors, wouldn't be trained per se, but I think the personal connection and supports and relationships which refugees form with the private sponsors, I think provided some level of social connection that probably helped. And, we found when we talked to the people with private sponsors, a majority of them said that those relationships were absolutely essential to them resettling successfully in Canada. So those relationships and that personal support was really important. And the other telling indicator was, the sponsorship, the private sponsorship relationship only lasts for 1 year. It's a 1 year commitment, and then it officially ends. What we found, though, is 5 years after they arrived, 3/4 of the privately sponsored refugees still had a personal connection, had maintained a relationship with one or more of their private sponsors. So clearly something meaningful had been established. And that, I think, really, has probably made a difference in terms of refugees sort of recreating new lives. And I think maybe just to segue into, I think, a broader conclusion. So refugees arrived with a whole range of circumstances and backgrounds and supports. I mean, there was a lot of different ways that people arrived. But by the time that we interviewed them 5 years later, there weren't a lot of differences in how well people were doing.
That's very interesting.
Which is really interesting. And I think the main conclusion is most of the refugees who arrived in 2015, 2016, 5 years later, most of them actually felt pretty good about their lives in Canada in terms of their overall life satisfaction, in terms of feeling good about the decision to come, about how their kids are doing, about feeling welcomed in Canada and feeling in a safer place and feeling some optimism for the future and what their lives might be. Not everybody, but a clear majority of people, just regardless of the backgrounds and where they started, were feeling fairly good about their lives here. They had reestablished lives, meaningful lives in Canada, even if there were continued challenges and struggles with various things. And really the biggest struggles and challenges that refugees articulated years later is around financial well-being and job opportunities and employment, which is something that immigrants generally struggle with. We
At
know
the event
that.
I attended where your report was presented, some of the Syrian participants complained about the requirement for Canadian experience that,
Yes.
that employers typically have. And this is a complaint that I've heard from a number of people from all kinds of different immigrant communities here in Canada. So that's something that runs across the board, I think. And
yes. So the experience of this refugee cohort was in line with that. And we were talking to them 5 years after they arrived. And some of them were doing well, but many of them weren't. And there were a lot of frustrations. And we know already that this is a systemic problem in Canada, which really, we still need to solve it as a country. And so they experienced that. And that came out loud and clear. I mean, housing was an issue for some people and so forth. But I think in spite of those difficulties, most felt positive about their lives and where they lived. And again, if they were parents, how their children were doing and had some optimism for the future. And many of them felt felt a stronger identity to Canada than to their ethnic background. It wasn't
very
either or, like, people didn't have to choose, but many of them really bought into being Canadian. And almost all of them either became citizens or were on the path to become citizens. And very, very few weren't interested, very few. And very few expressed any interest to move to some other country when it was possible. So I think that we could say it's largely successful for the most part. And we, of course, do not have comparison studies with other refugee groups and other immigrant groups. So we cannot say this is how much better
Right.
than others? That is a very important question. We only studied one particular cohort at one time. But I think what we would conclude, and we do conclude this way, is that this is largely a successful resettlement of a large refugee population, but it is reflective of a unprecedented mobilization
Right.
of resources and leadership
Right.
across sectors and institutions in Canada. And so it demonstrates what's possible.
Mm-hmm. When the
But
will
we
is there,
know
right?
but we know that this same mobilization has not happened for
Yeah.
all the other groups.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a very good point.
So it doesn't mean that Canada has figured this out and has it right across the board,
No.
but we have documented it for this particular
Yeah.
cohort.
And it almost seems partially it was just happenstance because massively tragic as it was, I think the picture of the poor little boy Alan Kurdi,
Alan Kurdi,
who
yes.
drowned in the sea and was
Yes.
lying face down, and someone photographed him, and then the picture was shown widely here in Canada. I mean, that aroused a kind of indignation in society as to why we weren't doing more. And so then, yes, the government did mobilize all of these resources and mobilized the population, even sort of without directly pitching it to people, as you pointed out, did something massive about it and successfully. And perhaps where there are, tragedies that are probably no lesser, but are less poignantly visible as exemplified or personified in one particular child, there perhaps it isn't as immediately relevant to a lot of people here, or doesn't seem that way. So here I wanted to briefly raise two other reports that were issued by the Environics Institute recently.
Sure.
And one of these, as I mentioned in our preliminary discussions, one of these is the one about race relations in Canada, and the other one is about immigrants and refugees in Canada and the public's view of them. And the reason why I want to raise these two particular reports is I think that these are the two that are the most directly relevant to the experience of the Syrian refugees here. The one on race relations, it, as you well know, it highlights the experiences of several different racialized groups. Among them, of course, are Indigenous Canadians, and there are Black Canadians and Chinese Canadians and so on. But one of the groups that are discussed and studied in the report are Muslims in Canada. And I find this particularly interesting given that I myself am a Canadian Muslim. And so, first of all, a preliminary question about this, and then I'll try to relate it to the Syrians. The preliminary question is why Muslims were included in a report on race relations at all, given that, for example, when you will find just anecdotally, there's a Facebook post about Muslims in the West, or there's a YouTube video about Muslims in the West, and immediately, or a Reddit post or whatever it may be, immediately you'll find a lot of negative comments underneath, usually, and then someone will respond saying, why are you being racist towards these people? And then someone else will respond by saying, well, since when are Muslims a race? So if I criticize Muslims, that's not being racist, right? So then why would you take the opposite approach and actually study Muslims alongside racial categories?
Well, that's a good question. Let me answer it. First thing I'll say is that our institute has been interested in doing research with the Muslim community going back to our very founding. Our very first survey in 2006 was the first ever national survey of Muslims in Canada.
Wow.
2006. Because we wanted to understand this population, which had so many stereotypes attached to it. And then 10 years later, we did a second survey, national survey of Muslims, because we wanted to do a follow-up, and no one else was doing it. So we have a long-standing interest in helping understand this particular population. And there are a lot of stereotypes, as you know, and a lot of misunderstanding. And it sort of had at one point, because of 9/11 and other issues, sort of got demonized. So we have a lot of research on that, which is on our website. But to answer your question, you raise a good question. But the answer is that this research is research we do in partnership with the Canadian Race Relations Foundation, which is a leading national organization in Canada. And their mandate has expanded to look at Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. So that is part of their mandate. And strictly speaking, being Muslim is not a race. Being Jewish is not a race. I happen to be Jewish, so I have some experience with this. So it doesn't quite fit in that sense. But we still wanted in this year's survey, because we've been doing this research every few years, to expand the scope of experience to the perspectives and experiences of people by religion, and specifically Muslims and Jews who might be racialized as well. And we sort of built that into the research.
Right.
And one of the reasons why we did that this year is because this year's survey, we had a major section of the report looking at hate experience, being a victim of a hate crime or a hate incident. And obviously, Muslims and Jewish Canadians are certainly vulnerable. And in fact, they are more vulnerable than many other Canadians, but
Right.
not necessarily the most. So it is a bit conceptually a bit complex to look at people by religion or ethnicity in a survey about race. And so it's sort of a broad definition of race for that reason.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, when it comes to how we can relate this to the experience of Syrian refugees in particular, there were three categories that I think are relevant in there among all the different ethnic and racial and religious categories where people were asked whether they or members of their group were subject to discrimination in Canada or to hate crimes, and whether they believed other groups that were named were similarly subject to those things. Now, the three categories that I think are relevant are Muslims and Christians also show up at one point in one of the tables at least, and then also Arabs. And what I found really interesting is that while it showed that most people who were surveyed think that Muslims are a fairly discriminated against group, as you mentioned, not the most, but among them. And the Muslims themselves actually felt that they were the most discriminated against group. The same cannot be said of Arabs as an ethnic category. And the numbers for discrimination there were fairly low in the table I was looking at. And then for Christians, they were very low. So then if one is, and here we come back essentially to the religious and ethnic categorization of the Syrian refugees. If we look at, for example, an Arab Christian Syrian refugee, who some of them were, then I wonder if they would be spared the kinds of discrimination that perhaps a Muslim Syrian refugee, whether Arab or Kurdish, might face. Now, of course, there's this conceptual overlap between the surveys, but at the same time, but the questions that were asked were not the same. So we cannot really know, I suppose, right, what the answer would be when it comes to Syria.
Actually, we can. We can actually, because so some of the questions about experiences with discrimination in our ongoing race relations survey, we actually included in our survey of Syrian refugees.
I see. Okay. Well, that's
and so we have some comparable data around the same time period. And the basic answer to your question is Syrian refugees as a group were more likely to experience discrimination than Canadians in general.
Right.
But they were less likely to experience it than people who were Black or Indigenous or even Muslims overall. So they, they were sort of in the middle, so to speak. I mean, we did ask them. So despite everything else that we found in our research about the refugees finding a welcoming community and a welcoming country, many of them said they did experience discrimination. They tended to say it was because of their ethnicity rather than their religion.
Okay.
Although women, it was more religion, probably because of hijab. Yes. Yeah. But the Syrian refugee group were less likely to feel targeted than many other racialized Canadians in the same time period. And why is that the case? Well, they may have been in more protected communities or spaces with private sponsors, who knows? Or they may have been less attuned to the forms in which discrimination takes place. Microaggressions, which can be subtle, right? Things which, if you're not that familiar with the culture, you might not realize somebody's being disrespectful.
Yeah.
So it's hard to know why, but we were able to look at that. And of course, the details of all of that are in our reports. If one of your podcast subscribers would like to dig into the details.
Right, for sure. And almost my last question, and that is regarding the report on immigration and refugees. As you highlight, now the data are from 2023, if I'm not mistaken. Like the
2024 is our most recent.
I see. Okay, thanks.
Fall 2024.
Right. So quite recent. So there, people are asked whether the level of immigration that's happening in Canada is too high, and a fairly large proportion say that it is. And that's, of course, part of, as the report points out explicitly, it's part of people's concerns with the cost of living and the cost of housing in particular, and the way that somehow or other in the public discourse, that problem or that dual problem has been linked to the rise in population. And since most of the rise in population has been or is attributable to the large number of immigrants in general that have been coming to Canada in the last few years, then people have been saying that the number of immigrants is too high. And also a substantial, a fairly large number of people basically do not agree that taking in refugees should be a very high priority for Canada at this particular moment in time, or at least like the latest data are from. So in this kind of climate, I wonder if, and you alluded to this already, but given this kind of perhaps shift or change or evolution in mentality, I wonder whether there would be the same kind of openness towards other refugees that we've seen with the Syrian situation, or do you think the Syrian case was a kind of spectacular one-off that would be hard to repeat in Canada?
Well, you've asked a few things. Let me address some of these. So before I get to that, so just to, I guess, give my interpretation of the data. So we have been measuring Canadian attitudes about immigration for about 40 years. We have seen significant changes over time. But for much of the last 20 years, most Canadians were fairly supportive of immigration levels and sort of ambivalent about who was coming, but gradually becoming more comfortable with the diversity of people coming. Starting about 2 years ago, there has been rising concern about the level of immigration.
Yeah.
And we have seen a steady rise in concern about the level of immigration as you described. So while 2 years ago, only a minority of Canadians felt there were too many immigrants, last fall it was almost 6 in 10. And the way I would characterize it is not necessarily concerned about the cost of living and housing per se. I think that's part of it. But broadly speaking, I think Canadians have come to be concerned about the country's capacity to take in 400,000 people a year and find places for everybody and, fit them in with everybody else.
So when you mention fitting them in, if it's not to do with what that does to rent levels, etc., then do you mean culturally fitting them in?
Well, it means a lot of things, and we only ask so many questions. So people, I think that part of it is, not everybody believes that immigrants have driven up housing prices. Some people do, and I have to say that's been in the media enough to plant the idea in people's heads. And I'm saying that because we asked the question sort of about the national impact, but then we asked a question about what's happening in their own community with newcomers. And while a lot of people connect high immigration levels with the cost of living, cost of housing nationally, they don't make that connection in their own community. Right. People are not seeing that on the ground. That suggests that people are absorbing this on social media, in other media, things they're hearing. It's like, why is the cost of everything being so high? There must be a reason. No, it must be this and that. I think part of it's around international students. And obviously, we've learned that, the number of students came in was beyond the capacity of the college. Like, that's not necessarily cost of living or housing.
That's a good
point. I guess what I'd like to just finish this point with is the fact that what's clear is that there is now a much greater concern about how many people can the country take in and not be a disservice either to the immigrants or the people already living here. And it's a capacity issue. And why that's important is this is the first time, I think, in maybe our country's history where capacity has been the concern about immigration. The concerns about immigration in the past have always been focused around who is coming. Where are they coming from? They're not like us, whatever, right? It's always been what places they're coming from, not the numbers. And now it's primarily around the numbers and the magnitude of it. And I think last fall, the federal government realized this. And, they cut things back because they recognized that there was, in practice, maybe a real capacity issue. We are not seeing a similar change in how people feel about where people are coming from. That has always been an issue for some Canadians. It still is. It always will be, like every place in the world. But that has not really changed. People have not become more xenophobic overall.
Right.
They've just been concerned about the numbers. So that really, I think, is the central insights from our research. We will be updating it again this fall to keep up.
Yeah, I look forward to
In
reading
response
that.
to your question about refugees, so we asked people about the priority that should be placed on different kinds of immigrants. And the top priority are people who contribute to the economy, people who have high skilled jobs and things like that. And students aren't given the same priority. Family reunification is the highest priority. Refugees are sort of in the middle of the list. It doesn't mean that people don't support refugees, but in comparative terms, they're not given as high a priority. But we need to be careful in interpreting that because we're not asking people to set immigration levels or numbers.
Right. Sure.
And the country has always taken a lot of economic migrants, and they've always taken a small number of refugees. And most Canadians would probably say that's right. In other words, even with the 50,000 Syrians coming in, that was still a small proportion of all the immigrants that came that year.
Right.
So I don't think Canadians have lost interest in refugee sponsorship or having refugees come, but a lot depends on where they're coming from and what's happening in the world. So to take an example, we know that we look back a couple of years and saw a huge influx of Ukrainians coming, fleeing the war, the aggression from Russia. And the country did mobilize to some extent and took in a lot of Ukrainians.
Right. I would see the welcome desks at Pearson Airport and so on, for example.
Right. We did not see the same mobilization for people from Afghanistan for all kinds of reasons. And, there's some resentments about that and so forth. But there also wasn't a pushback. It was not an active resistance. It was a question of where I think the government placed its priorities and its resources and opened the taps and mobilized. And they mobilized more for Ukrainians than for Afghanistan. I think a lot of it has to do with politics. There are something like 1 million people with Ukrainian descent living in Canada. So that makes a difference. So what would happen next? I think if I could speculate, I think, the country is feeling much more stressed than it was in 2015. The cost of living, housing, infrastructure challenges in cities. We now have all kinds of threats from the US and tariffs. I mean, there are all kinds of things happening. I think the capacities that organizations and governments have are probably less than they were 10 years ago. I think it's also fair to say that the settlement sector, all those nonprofit organizations that are doing the work on the ground, I think are feeling particularly stressed because their funding has been reduced and cut, and they're running off their feet. So I think the capacity of Canada right now to mobilize for another big influx is probably much more limited just because of circumstances. And so I think it would be more of a challenge to mount that. That being said, a new crisis erupts somewhere around the world, and a crisis where there is significant Canadian population. It's hard to predict this sort of thing, but I don't think it's out of the question that Canada can mobilize again. And, I think that one of the scenarios that perhaps we might look at would be asylum seekers coming up from the U.S.
That's what I was thinking, actually.
This could become very significant.
There are academics moving in ones and twos and threes and so on, but it could become like more of a mass movement, like with the loyalists or with
and so
people, draft dodgers during the Vietnam era and so on.
Yeah. So we could see something happening here. And it's really hard to predict the when and who. But I think that my sense is that the Canadian sentiment will be to welcome.
Right.
And there will be concerns about capacity, especially in the cities and communities near the border, as what happened a few years ago, where, in Quebec, eastern townships, and much because people are at the border, they're going to be coming into certain parts of Canada. Right. And those parts of Canada are going to be experiencing an influx. So this will definitely be an issue. And I'm sure it's something that governments are looking at carefully. But it cannot be controlled the way that you could control resettlement from the Middle East.
Yeah, because it's not a plane journey. You can just walk across the border.
Well, and it's a big border.
Yeah.
And, the leverage that Canada has with the U.S. is limited. And a lot of it may depend on how the US government decides to treat people that are turned back. This is already coming up as an issue. Canada cannot turn a blind eye to what happens to people that they do not accept.
Definitely. Yeah.
So I think this is going to be a new chapter, I think, in the refugee story in Canada, and we'll have to wait and see how this unfolds. But I guess just to end, I think that while the country's capacity may be diminished for all kinds of reasons, I don't think the country's openness to accepting refugees and newcomers has been diminished significantly, or, it certainly hasn't disappeared. I think it's still there, and it'll just be a question of what can we mobilize and what can we pull together to be welcoming.
That's a great optimistic note to end on. And so then my final question is something slightly different, and that is about you personally. I was wondering how you got into the field of social research and public opinion research in general.
Well, like most people, I sort of fell into it. And, I have a graduate degree in the social sciences, and I've never had an academic position. So I never had an interest in doing that kind of scholarly work. It was more about doing applied work. And I spent a number of years in my career working in private survey research companies, doing public opinion research for government and, the private sector and NGOs, and helping them understand their markets in communities and so forth. It's a way to help organizations, and I think help achieve positive goals. But about 20 years ago, I had an opportunity to help establish the Environics Institute, which is different because we're doing public interest research, which means we're not doing research to help a particular government or organization further its objectives. We're basically trying to generate knowledge and insight that everyone in Canada, whether they're in government, NGOs, or citizens, can better understand who we are as a country and where we're going. And we set this up because there weren't other organizations doing the same work. The work we do is being done because no one else has stepped up to do it. So we feel that we're, contributing something. And it's very rewarding to be able to share it and not have to sell it. We can be generous with it.
You can give it away as you do.
We have to find a way to fund it and pay for it. And as soon as we do that, we do the work and then we put it into the world. And we hope others will find it and make use of it. So that really is sort of the motivation to be doing this kind of work. And it's very fulfilling.
Right. Well, thank you so much for the work that you do and for sharing your findings with us, for explaining things to our audience. I think you've given people a lot to think about and motivation to learn about these things in more detail. Like I said, I'll be posting links to the various things, the reports and so on that we mentioned for the benefit of our audience. So thank you very much once again, and Chag Sameach, and I will...
Oh, thank you. Yeah, thank you. This was a very engaging interview. I really appreciate your questions and the opportunity to speak to this. So that's great. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
I look forward to seeing the finished product.
Right. So I hope that you found my discussion with Keith interesting and informative, just like I did. Stay tuned for further episodes of the Guildwood Review. Watch our previous episodes. And of course, like, subscribe, comment, and share. If you'd like to support the work that goes into this podcast, feel free to contribute towards a coffee through Buy Me a Coffee, or else subscribe to be a sponsor on Patreon. Until we meet again, goodbye.